An important part of preparing for your IELTS exam is to learn a lot of different English words, to have a broad vocabulary. Today's lesson will be helpful not just for the speaking portion of the exam, but for all portions of it. Today's lesson continues on from our previous lesson of using words instead of very. Up until now, we've looked at examples of words instead of very that are positive. So in this lesson, we'll look at examples of words instead of very in a negative situation. For example, if you're asked questions about things you do not like, you could use these words in your IELTS exam to improve your grade and also to sound more like a native English speaker. Before we go into examples that you can use, let's look at some examples in movies where the word very is used, as well as examples where the word very is not used. Our first example today is from the movie Oz, the Great and Powerful, where Theodora is talking to the townspeople.
There's so much good here. It sickens me.
Here, she says, "There is so much good here, it sickens me." This is a great example where instead of saying something like, "It's very disgusting," she actually puts more emphasis onto it and she says, "This sickens me." You'll see that in a lot more adult movies or a lot more movies that aren't aimed towards kids, because you can use more complex words. So instead of saying very disgusting, in this case, she can say sickens. Let's look at another example. This time, we'll see a scene from the Little Mermaid where Scuttle the seagull is talking to Ariel.
Now the Snarfblat dates back to prehistorical times when humans used to sit around and stare at each other all day. Got very boring.
Now in this clip, Scuttle says, "Now the Snarfblat dates back to prehistoric times when humans used to sit around and stare at each other all day. Got very boring." So what could he have said instead of very boring in this case? So instead of saying it got very boring, he could say it got mundane or it became mundane. But the reason he doesn't say this is because it's a children's movie, and so having it as "it's very boring" also adds to the joke. Well, it's great to see a few examples in movies, but how about we now turn to examples that you can use in your IELTS exam, and let's go through a few examples now of words to use instead of very in a negative situation. Instead of saying, "I'm very afraid of going into the dark," you can instead say, "I'm fearful of going into the dark," or "I'm anxious going into the dark," or finally, "I'm frightened of going into the dark." Next up, instead of saying the journey was very risky, you could instead say the journey was perilous, or the journey was dangerous, or also the journey was treacherous. Instead of saying yesterday's exam was very difficult, you could instead say yesterday's exam was complex, or yesterday's exam was arduous, or finally yesterday's exam was tough. Instead of saying the witch was very bad, you could instead say the witch was wicked, or the witch was evil, or the witch was malicious. Instead of saying the rubbish smelt very nasty, you could instead say the rubbish smelt sickening, or the rubbish smelt disgusting, or the rubbish smelt vile. Instead of saying the lecturer was very boring, you could instead say the lecturer was dull, the lecturer was mundane, or the lecturer was uninteresting. And finally, instead of saying, "I hope my answers don't look very dumb," you could instead say, "I hope my answers don't look foolish," or "I hope my answers don't look stupid." And finally, you could also say, "I hope my answers don't look moronic." These are some examples of words you can use instead of adding very to words you already know. I'll include a comment below with an example of a sentence I used recently when I tried not to use the word very in a negative situation, but I also want you to comment below with examples of sentences that you've used recently where you haven't used the word very. If you can't think of an example, maybe just include a sentence below that does have the word very in it, and I'll give you an example where you can use a different word instead. Hopefully these examples give you some ideas for using words instead of very in a negative situation, and make sure you practice them in your everyday life to get better at using these alternate words. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.